repression that we're seeing and the use of force and crackdown on peaceful protests, especially the encampment, did not start with that. It started way after, shortly after October 7, with the protest expressing solidarity with the Palestinian people, despite the fact that many universities and even outside police departments, for example, in New York or other places, try to claim that these protests were in support of Hamas as designated terrorist organization. But these actions that by students were specifically made clear that they were in solidarity with Palestinian people in Gaza. They turned into demands that were made to the universities, particularly to disclose the financial dealings that universities have with Israel, and particularly with supporting Israel's military operations and military actions in Gaza, in committing the assault on Palestinian civilians in Gaza in particular. And it also, there was a demand for divesting from these financial transactions or support that is going from universities with the state of Israel, and particularly the emphasis was on military actions. There was also a demand of these peaceful encampments to provide amnesty to students and faculty, those who had been punished, students with disciplinary actions were excessive and extreme, for participating in peaceful protests, and for allegedly violating university rules. And the fourth demand has been to prevent militarized police and outside police force from coming into college campuses. So these are the four demands that are more or less have been raised by the student movement that we have seen in the United States. But again, I want to emphasize that the repression did not also start after October 7th. In the United States, we've seen repression specifically against people taking action on college campuses in particular, taking student action protests, organizing events, academic events, student events, that were being subject to restrictions or censorship that we have not seen in other contexts. We don't have the time to go over them, but I would like to share, if Laura you can share the resources from Palestine Legal, who have monitored the situation for years. In fact, for over 10 years, since the existence of Palestine Legal, they have particularly focused on repression against students and academics in the context of their speaking, engaging in activities that are constitutionally protected activities on college campuses that were not seen in context, other contexts of protests. So that is an important point, because that goes back to the special rapporteur's point about the discriminatory treatment of these protests. That's a bedrock principle, is that universities have to have a universal, they have to have a consistent, clear, and non-discriminatory policies related to the management or the regulation of protests on college campuses. The time and place and manner can be regulated, and the schools have the right to state where they should, where people on college campuses, whether are university students or faculty members or administrators or who work in the administration who are protesting, how they can do that. And what we've seen in the United States, that these rules kept changing dramatically, sometimes with no transparency at all, no notices, or students did not know what are the new rules, with a free expression zones that are considered historically for expressing speech, and including encampments, were banned. So there is a serious concern that we have seen universities taking unequal and discriminatory approaches to the way that they regulated or tried to address the protest on college campuses. One of the things that I will very quickly mention also is the fact that the ACLU has been very clear about its position that while the universities have the obligations to protect safety of all students and to provide equal access to education to all students, this should not be jeopardizing free speech, assembly or protest rights and constitutional protections, particularly in those public schools, and including academic freedom. And what we've seen is that what universities have done in the first weeks and months after October 7 is that they have particularly emphasized the safety of certain group of students. And they have made that clear in statements, in positions that they put forward, and engagement with the student community, with the university and college communities. They have not done the same kinds of, or did not make statements or take action to protect all students' safety. And another one of the things that is very clearly illustrated by Palestine Legal and other organizations been monitoring that, the fact that students have requested repeatedly protections from particularly students who are identified as Palestinian or Palestinian students, or those who are Muslim, Middle Eastern, and even Jewish students who were protesting the war in Gaza, have asked the universities to provide resources and support against attacks and safety concerns that they had, including doxing that was happening from forces from outside universities, from people who have been threatening and sometimes even used chemical weapons, as we've seen in the case of the Columbia students who have been attacked by other students on college campuses, and that was not taken seriously. So we have shared, and I will put in the chat the letter that we sent to college to all university heads and university and college, and we emphasized 4 principles that the universities have to adhere to. First, they must not single out particular viewpoints for censorship, discipline, or disproportionate punishment. And we've seen that repeatedly from the reports that we received, that there was extreme and disproportionate punishment leveled against those protesters, student protesters who were protesting the war in Gaza. And that's something that needs to be stopped, that need to be addressed, and need to be investigated. Second, we said that they must also protect students from targeted discriminating harassment and violence, but may not penalize them for taking sides on the war in Gaza, even if they are expressing deeply offensive terms. And that's something that I want to relate to the way some of universities have interpreted expressions of solidarity with the Palestinian people as offensive speech that somehow had to be banned from college campuses. In particular, the call for freedom from the river to the sea, or free Palestine, or other chants that were put forward by student movement. Many universities interpret that as a call for violence, or if there's invocation of the word intifada, which literally means uprising, and could mean all kinds of uprising that happen, including the students themselves said that this is an uprising that we're doing here at the university campuses, has been considered by some universities as an expression of offensive language or even incitement to violence. So that needs to be very clear, that even such uncomfortable, offensive terms should not be banned and should not be targeted for discriminatory punishment and disciplines. The third principle that we emphasize to university heads is that they can announce and enforce reasonable content-neutral time, place, or manner policies on protecting protesting activity or any kind of assemblies. But they must leave ample room for students to express themselves. What we've seen is that universities, as I said earlier, kept changing the rules in a way that was not transparent, it was not equal, it was not projecting that the universities indeed cares about free speech and academic freedom and protest on college campuses. And if anything, they pushed these protests to be sidelined to places where the message of the protest would be disregarded or would be completely ignored, because they would be in a place where they would not be able to reach the larger student community. That's exactly what the purpose of a protest. The fourth principle that we emphasize is that they must recognize that armed police, militarized police on college campuses can endanger students and should not be utilized only in a measure of last resort. That is a violation that we've seen over and over again in a number of college campuses, both private and public universities. In the private universities, what we've seen in the United States is that the universities have called the police to come in to arrest students for the charge of trespassing on their own college campuses, even though they have not been notified that they were trespassing or they have not been dismissed from the universities. They obviously had to do that retroactively in order to justify the trespassing on property. Some of the university campuses are not closed or not walled off. They are part of public spaces or private and public spaces designated areas, such as the campuses like NYU. And so we've seen the universities escalating the repression by calling in remilitarized police. And that in of itself has become a serious violation of their right and ultimately led to people be arrested, violently mishandled, and certain use of less lethal weapons, what we've seen happening, including on college campuses like UCLA, which is a public university, where we've seen a use of tear gas and even some instances of rubber bullets have been used on some campuses. The last principle that we emphasize is that there should be the university college campuses heads and administration should resist the pressures placed on them by politicians seeking to exploit campus tensions. We've seen that again over and over again. The fact that there is a congressional investigation that is led by the Republican majority in the House that is investigating anti-Semitism on college campuses has been used or misused as a way to pressure administrations, university administrators, and presidents to take action specifically against those who are protesting in support or in solidarity with the Palestinian people. And there were specific questions asked of these universities. What are you doing to punish those students? They were not really that interested in anti-Semitism or attacks on Jewish students merely for being Jewish students, because Jewish students who were protesting with Gaza, as we've heard over and over again, said they were attacked more from police intervention, from those who are outside so-called agitators, from organizations who call them foreign agents, who call them Hamas supporters and try to link them to support terrorism. So these kinds of things had led to further crackdown and repression on college campuses. So universities should not be listening to outside voices, whether they are donors or trustees or politicians who are trying to make the situation worse. And lastly, I want to mention the issue that was mentioned earlier by Arif and I think other speakers, related to the use of the distorted definition of anti-Semitism. That is the IHRA definition. That is a definition that not only that some universities have adopted. So if you are calling for one state that is democratic, where all Jews and Palestinians live as equal citizens, would be violating that definition of anti-Semitism. That means even Jewish students, as the special rapporteur on education said, what's astounding is that even Jewish students who are participating in those protests are themselves be considered under this definition as anti-Semite. So this definition has been rejected by even many Jewish American organizations that are seeing the threat to free speech, and they're not seeing that as helpful and productive in the fight against anti-Semitism. Rather, it is clearly been designed and used in order to shut down and close conversations, restrict activism on college campuses that particularly criticize Israel, criticize Zionism, criticized the policies and particularly what's happening, the genocide that's happening in Gaza. And lastly, the use of terrorism. So if the student activism is not portrayed or being accused as anti-Semitism, the other charge was supporting terrorism. And that's another area where the ACLU, with many other organizations, have been expressing deep concerns related to the idea that there would be expanding the definition of material support to terrorism to include constitutionally protected activism on college campuses, particularly by student university groups that have nothing to do with any designated organizations as terrorist organizations. The issue in the United States have also been in a historic proportion in terms of the protest itself on campuses and also outside campuses. I mean, the people who are protesting on the streets. And I think that level of participation from a very diverse group of people, as the Special Rapporteur mentioned, is very noticeable. It's very encouraging to see that people are resorting to protests in the way to engage in and to try to make a difference in their own countries, and particularly those that live in democratic societies. That is something that is the heart of any democracy. And what we've seen in the last few months is that repression is also backfiring, meaning that not only that it's not ending those very peaceful, legitimate protests, but there are more people who are now daring and breaking this sort of fear that some people may have had in engaging in expressing their views, in participating offline, not just online. And I think that in of itself is really important to preserve and protect, and further crackdown and attempts to do all those things, whether to silence, censor, restrict, punish people, particularly in the context of college campuses, where you expect that a higher level of respect and protection for free speech exists. And in fact, historically, it has been the case in many places, and definitely in the United States. And you can go back to the wars in Vietnam, the protesting the civil rights movement across the country, protesting even more recent wars like the war in Iraq or a war in Afghanistan. There's been always mobilization, and I think we have not seen that sort of persistence of such protests happening, and the way that it had attempted to engage on the substance rather than it was just about. And I think that's where really the point is, that instead of engaging and allowing this protest to have a debate, to have a more discussion on the issue itself, on the root causes, or the need to stop atrocities or protection of civilians or war, etc. No matter what your view on all of this, there's an attempt to shut down the conversation altogether, and that in of itself is very dangerous and very troubling. And what we're seeing is also resurrection of the new McCarthyism, right? That is that a political actors, including powerful members of Congress and powerful committees in Congress, that are taking the lead in shutting down these protests and using the same similar allegations or accusations of smearing people for protesting as if they are identifying with terrorism, as if they are anti-Semite, as if they are expressing disloyalty to the United States by expressing their views and dissenting. Especially in a context of the upcoming presidential elections, that we're seeing there will be more protests happening, while the protests and college campuses, maybe some of them are continuing in some of peaceful encampments, but some of them likely to continue in the fall when students come back to university. So in that context, there have been many attempts to use Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is an important part of the United States government, United States civil rights laws that were enacted pursuant to the civil rights movement, to the call for racial justice in this country. And the Title VI basically says that that no entity that receives federal financial assistance should prohibit discrimination, should engage in discrimination, excuse me, on the basis of race, color, and national origin in its programs and activities, right? So there's a clear prohibition against discrimination on those bases. And what we're seeing is that certain groups, particularly those groups that are aligned with defending Israel's actions, have launched and alleged violations of Title VI against universities for allowing peaceful protests to happen in protesting Israel's violations, including the war in Gaza. And I think that there may be instances where individuals, particularly if they were subjected to discrimination or intimidation or harassment, should and must be investigated. But most of the Title VI, the Civil Rights Act complaints that were filed to the Civil Rights Office in the Department of Education, many of them at least have been based on the idea that these student encampment protests have been engaging in anti-Semitic activities, and they're engaging in discrimination against students, particularly Jewish students, because they have raised chants like from the river to the sea, or free Palestine, or other statements around the Intifada, which, as I said earlier, literally means uprising in Arabic, and those sort of things, where those kind of statements are fully protected, political protected speech, and that those kinds of complaints ultimately will have to be reviewed. We know that from the past, and during the Obama administration, all of these complaints that were launched against student activism, again, in the context of Palestine, were rejected by the Civil Rights Office, and they did the right thing of not allowing violations of free speech, and putting that pressure on the universities. And we are hoping that the administration, and we have sent a letter to Secretary of Education to reject, again, the adoption of the distorted definition of anti-Semitism that would make such statements or actions that oppose Israel's actions in Gaza as anti-Semitic. And that is problematic because we already have also protections against discrimination under our civil rights law. So we don't need further protection that only going to infringe on very basic freedoms, including free speech, that's protected under the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So that is also troubling if there will be a different administration that may not take that position. And we know that the previous administration, the Trump administration, issued an executive order adopting this anti-Semitic definition of anti-Semitism under the IHRA. And that now there is an attempt to go to Congress to do the same. And we put in the chat the letter that we sent to the House. Unfortunately, the House of Representatives adopted that legislation. It's now before the Senate, and we're hoping that this will not go through, because this will be setting a very terrible precedent. If that sort of weaponization of civil rights investigations will go forward, it could be used against other protesters,